Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you're joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Amazon Music, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Jamie Rotante. She is a senior editor at Archie Comics. She is here to celebrate all the fun and amazing things happening with that classic comic book series. Before we invite Jamie into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Carry Me Home, the poignant middle grade novel by Janet Fox. This really is a wonderful book. Janet was on the podcast celebrating this book not too long ago. It's a really powerful reminder that homelessness is not helplessness. In this book, we're going to meet two sisters who are struggling to keep their father's disappearance a secret. They both know that one simple mistake could separate them forever. They realize that family is all around us, and they must learn to trust their new friends and community. Carry Me Home will help you start some wonderful conversations with your kids about homelessness, about empathy, and about compassion. Get your copy today, Carry Me Home by Janet Fox. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Vroom, Barry, Carey, and the Power Boost by William G. Wilberforce III. This is a really, really fun book. William Wilberforce III is a health coach and life trainer. He skillfully shares his background in those two fields with young readers to help them to remind them of the importance of believing in oneself, focusing on what you can control in your life, and remaining positive and hopeful. Families and educators of young children will welcome the invitation for discussion that this joyful book brings. Vroom, Barry, Carey, and the Power Boost is an uplifting story with a powerful message about working hard, learning, and trying your best. Get your copy today, Vroom, Barry, Carey, and the Power Boost by William Wilberforce III. Join us right now from right outside of New York City. Our guest today is the senior editor of the Archie Comic strips. I'm really excited to welcome her to the show. Please welcome Jamie Rotante. Hey, Jamie, how are you?
Hey, Chad, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Did I get your title correct?
Yes. Senior editor, senior director of editorial, same.
Archie Comics are one of those things. Well, how old is Archie? Because I'm almost 100, and I was reading Archie when I was a kid.
We just celebrated the 80th anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing that characters can affect generations.
Yes.
And that you're still, and we're not talking about one piece or 4 or 5 comics that have lasted a lifetime. We're talking about I guess franchise is the proper term, a franchise that has morphed and grown and is still creating new content 8 decades after its birth.
Right.
Yeah. So tell us, in a nutshell, a little bit about Archie.
Yeah. So, you gave it such a wonderful introduction because Archie really has just continued and been going on for these past 80 years. And one thing that we really like to always remember at Archie is for everyone. So for a lot of people, Archie is their introduction to reading. You have the classic strips that, started, they're very of their time when Archie first started. It's always been very much a spotlight on whatever's happening at the time, but with a little bit more of a fun twist. You have Archie, who's the everyman. He's a teenager. He's got, the 2 girls he's in love with, Betty and Veronica, and their friends and, their whole group. And it's just that idealistic high school sort of Americana. There's always something funny happening, always something wacky, and people can just relate to it so easily because of that. So you have when we started and we were right in the middle of World War II, and it created just this really nice sense of just escapism for anybody that wanted it. And then that kept going, year after year after year. And over these last few decades, we've really seen how Archie has morphed to fit just the changing times and the changing audiences. So we still have our fun humor classic for, younger folks and for older people who read it when they were younger and have gone back to it now. But then we've also dipped our toes into so many other genres like horror and, more drama, especially with the TV show Riverdale, which really opened a lot of new doors for us to access new audiences. But at our core, where we never forget that so many of our fans were fans from a very young age. Again, many of them started not only their journey into comics, but their journey into reading in general with an Archie digest or just a classic Archie book. And even if they step away from the character and the brand for a while, even if they feel like they've outgrown it, we always have something for them to return to when they decide to come back. We'll always be here with something for our fans.
Yeah. As you're talking, and you mentioned that for many kids, Archie is their introduction to reading, especially independent reading. And I recall when I was a kid, growing up in the inner city, we had a library, but you had to walk to it. It was a couple of miles away. And it was the old classic 100 years ago library where you had to walk in. You couldn't make any sounds, and it was kind of creepy and not very welcoming like libraries are today. But for me, my library was our corner store. And right next to the phone booth in front of the ice cream cooler, there was this little rack, and the owner sold paperbacks and comic books. For some reason, didn't have covers. None of them had a cover on it. It was so strange. But that was my Barnes and Noble, and I would go in there, and it was the place where I could go with the nickel or the dime that I had earned from doing something and make a choice, and especially make a reading choice. And Archie was one of those choices that I was making.
Yeah, and for a lot of kids, it's that same experience. If it's not that, it's the racks at the end of the aisle at a grocery store. It's always in that prime spot where, eye level for kids, they see it, and it's always just this burst of color and fun, usually where you least expect it. And that in and of itself is just always so eye-catching for a younger audience.
Yeah. So tell us who created Archie.
So Archie was created by John L. Goldwater and Michael Silbergleit, and the company is still owned by the families that started Archie. So it's still a family-owned company. It's still independently owned. It's still, private company. It's just been a family legacy and clearly just, a love of the character and the franchise that has kept it going. And I think that's also what makes it so unique, is that it's a small, dedicated team and a family company. So the care that is there for these characters and the IP is just like no other.
Yeah. It's hard for me to wrap my head around the idea that, this little cute little story that I loved bringing home and reading in my room has morphed into this, not a giant Disney-like corporation, but a big company that's employing lots of people with all the different ways that Archie is being told these days.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, we've had so many different dips into media in the past where we've had movies and we've had cartoons. We had big, filmation series in the 70s. But in these last few years, especially with Riverdale and just the way we've seen the media expansion happen, it's so amazing, especially because, again, the homegrown company is still, on the smaller side, but it really is large when you think of the expanse of how many different avenues we're pursuing it and how many other opportunities where we have with television and media. And it's fun. It's fun to see it from the inside, but also to have that fan perspective, because I myself was reading Archie from a very young age. So to kind of see it and, in a sense, grow with it, both as a fan and as someone on the inside, it's really mind blowing.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about that inside perspective, but before we do, you and I was speaking earlier, and I was kind of sheepish when I said that, I loved Archie when I was a kid, but I hit a certain point in my life, and I think it was when I was looking in that little bookcase with books without covers, and I discovered when I was going for Archie, but then I discovered Mad Magazine. And at that point, it was like, Archie's a little bit too young for me, and I want to be a little bit daring and outrageous, and so I think I'll stick with Mad. You were saying that for a lot of people, that's a lot of people's experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Myself included, and just so many people that were fans. I think it's just, what happens when you grow up. Anything that you really held on to when you're younger, you hit an age where you feel like you have to move away from it because, that's baby stuff. That's what I liked when I was a kid. I need to like what all the cool kids like now. And, maybe secretly you still want to read those stories, but you feel like it's not cool to be seen reading this thing you read, even if it was just a year or two earlier. I will say though that even more so now than ever before, we have such an array of titles and genres we've gone into that if you feel like, I need to be more daring, you could pick up a horror book of ours, and it's still Archie and it's still these characters you know and love, but you're still within our world, you're still within this experience. And that's something we've really, really been working towards these past few years specifically, of just every pocket, every part of the audience, because we always say Archie is for ages 8 through 80. And we love having something for everyone in that range. So maybe the digest you once read when you were a kid, they're not clicking for you anymore. Well, here's this action adventure book. Here's this horror title. Here's this just modern, funny teenage take that we have that's a little bit more, if you're 16, it makes a little more sense for you than if you were, 8 or 9 reading it. We've really been working our hardest to just meet our fans where they are at any age. And wherever they are for accessibility reasons. We have our books available digitally. We have a direct consumer shop. So if you don't have a local comic store, you can buy it from there. We just always want to make sure our fans have access at any stage of their life and wherever they are to the content we're putting out.
Yeah. Now, you were talking earlier about the team that puts Archie together and all these different versions. When the folks at the Archie comic strip, the original kind of format, and do you all sit down when the folks at Riverdale decide, we want to take this story in this direction? Do you all have to kind of come together and go, okay, well, that makes sense, and that is true to what's been going on in Archie's life up until now? Or, the opposite is like, no, we don't think Archie would do that.
So that really comes down to our CEO, John Goldwater, who is the grandson of John L. Goldwater, who created Archie. He is really the person who has his feet in both, firmly planted in both. So anything that's going on in Riverdale, he knows about. Anything that's happening in the comic side, he knows about. But we're also lucky because the showrunner and creator of Riverdale is a writer, Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa, who is a massive Archie fan and has written some of our comics, most notably our horror comics. And because of that rich knowledge he has of the character and just his, intense love of it as a fan, even when he's taking the story in all of these, sort of ways that feel so different from anything we've ever done and so just extreme to some extent, there is such a care and concern for just preserving the characters' legacies that we never really have to worry too much. And of course we have our CEO, John, who is, very obviously, again, making sure everything's handled with care. But it's not so much this sort of like meeting room of, hey, we want to do this. Is this okay? Because that knowledge and that care is already there to begin with.
Yeah. I'm curious, how long have you been part of the Archie family?
This year will mark, is it 11 or 12 years? I think it's 11 years now. It's wild because it's gone by so quickly. Whenever I'm asked that, I have to like stop and be like, how is that possible?
And
And I am actually considered still one of the newer employees, because we have a lot of folks who have been there for even longer. Our current editor-in-chief, Mike Pellerito, has been there for 22 years this year, and he oversees all of our classic content, as well as, lots of other hats he wears. But he's been there for 22 years. We have some people coming up on 25. It's a company that people like to grow with.
yeah. So neat. I was going to ask, do you ever get, well, I don't know if bored is the word, but, you're dealing with the same kind of characters in the same kind of world, and 11 years for you and 22 years for the senior editor. That's a long time to be kind of playing with the same ingredients. Do you ever get the sense that, I want to add a new character, or I need to, go off and do something completely different?
Well, the thing that's great is we actually do have the ability to do that. So, especially speaking for editor-in-chief Mike, he's been starting to introduce new characters into the classic comments, especially more diversified cast, just really to make sure there's a lot more inclusivity and that anybody reading these books can pick it up and see a reflection of themselves in it. So it doesn't mean we're pushing out the core characters everyone knows, but we're always expanding that roster. And we have a massive roster. I think everybody knows the core four: Archie, Betty, Veronica, Jughead. If you go a little bit more into it, people know Reggie, Moose, Dilton, but there are easily just hundreds upon hundreds of characters, both ones that were more popular early on in the 40s and, maybe faded into obscurity a little bit, but we still have and we can still play with whenever. And then so many of the teenage characters that have been created over the years. And we just have a huge roster, and we've more recently been trying to get a lot more of those lesser known characters sort of into the spotlight too, just to be like, listen, as much as there's so much that we can do with Archie, Betty, and Veronica, because clearly the fact that we've been able to do all these different genres and just take them in all these different places shows that you never get bored with the sort of format. But on top of that, we do have the ability to expand, and we have already a very expanded roster. And in terms of just taking things in different directions, John Goldwater has been so amazing with really pushing us to just, come up with fun ideas. So for example, my first, full comic writing experience at Archie was I created a series called Betty and Veronica Vixens, which saw Betty and Veronica leading an all-female motorcycle gang. So it was really and that was something that was just like, go for it. Do it. Like, these characters can be put into any scenario. Don't hold back. And it was, it was really a trial by fire situation, because it was my first time writing an Archie comic, even though, I started as a proofreader, I worked into editorial. So I've been saying that my full-time job for the better part of the decade has been just reading Archie comics. So I felt comfortable being able to write for these characters, having read them as a fan and employee. But then to get to take them and put them into such a wacky, an extreme scenario was both intimidating and incredibly liberating at the same time.
Wow, that sounds like so much fun. I'm wondering, you mentioned the core characters, Archie, Veronica, Betty, and Jughead. When I was growing up, everybody had a nickname, and some of them weren't all that flattering. Like, Jughead's not a great nickname to have. Do you ever get any pushback from folks these days? Because now, if somebody, was known as Jughead in an elementary school, I'm sure the teachers would sit up and say, that's not cool, it's not complimentary. Do you get any pushback about his name?
No. That's one that I've never seen any complaints about. I think it's just because he's so beloved. I think he is just the epitome of Jughead. And I feel like anybody more recently that gets called that kind of associates it now with that character. So this thing that may at one time been negative almost has a positive spin on it now, because who doesn't want to be Jughead?
Yeah. Do Archie, Betty, Veronica, and Jughead have social media handles?
We did that briefly. for a while, but it's a lot. It's a lot to maintain all of these separate social media accounts speaking in the character voices. But it definitely is something, we did in the past, for sure.
Yeah. Imagining, we here at the Reading with Your Kids podcast, we're always encouraging families to experience media together, whether it's books or comics or movies. Tell me about some of the conversations you think families could have as they were sitting down, maybe reading a classy Archie comic, as opposed to some of the conversations they might have if they watch Riverdale together.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing, especially for reading the comic together, is just that sort of sense of familiarity, that sort of, hey, especially if you pick up our digest, because we have new stories in those, but we also have a ton of reprint from pretty much, the entirety of our publishing. So it's very likely that a parent could be reading that with their child and remember a story that was printed when they were their child's age. And just that ability to sort of have that, like, this is something I remember reading this, maybe even with my parent when I was your age. I think Riverdale is probably not something you'd want to watch with much younger children. I feel like that's definitely aged up more, so there'd probably be a lot of questions parents may not be ready to answer in that sense. And that's more of a like, oh wow, I recognize these characters. I can't believe they're in this scenario. But I feel like there's gotta even be a little bit of like, my teenager is watching this show of these characters that I loved, maybe in a different way when I was their age. So again, it goes back to that familiarity of like, this is what I enjoyed. This was a sort of rite of passage for me. Now it's for my child. I know for me personally, a big part of the reason I really got into Archie is because my grandmother encouraged it. She was, always encouraging me to read, but she grew up with a huge stack of Archie comics that her, parents bought for them when they were, in the 40s during war, just sort of as something for comfort. And that always stuck with her. So she was so happy to encourage me to read it too, because she was able to say like, I can name all those characters. I know the situations they're in. It's still funny. It's still comforting. And that just ability to have that comfort, especially, with so many of the challenges we've been facing these past few years, to stop and just have, we call it sort of just a comfort food comic, feels really important, sometimes now more than ever.
Mm-hmm. You bring up, things that are happening. Did Archie go through the pandemic?
Not in our stories. We were careful to not really touch upon that in the publishing because we wanted it to instead sort of be, again, escapism. Mm-hmm. But we weathered the storm on the publishing front. Obviously, there are a lot of incredibly difficult challenges just with supply chain issues, with everything. We switched to a working from home model, which helped. But honest to God, we realized, especially during this time, more than ever, people were looking for those classic stories. Mm-hmm. So we sort of saw a strengthening of the brand because, again, parents were taking time to read these digests and these classic books with their kids as just a moment of sort of escapism, but comfort as well. And that was just such a eye-opening moment for us of like, this is why Archie is still here. These are those moments that really show us what's important about what we do.
Yeah. I mentioned a couple of times going into that bookstore, that corner store and finding books, and it mentioned that they all didn't have a cover on it. That's the thing. Tell us about what that is, just so people know.
Actually, I'm not 100% sure about that myself. I want to say there's probably a really logical in the weeds response about just comic distribution at that time that led to that. But for us, our covers are some of the most important aspects. So that's so interesting that you sort of have this like grab bag of books without covers, because we put a lot of work into those covers, especially on our digest, which you would see on a rack like that. There is a absolute ton of time and thought put into the color choices, the way the characters are represented, the jokes. So I don't unfortunately have the answer to that, but it's kind of interesting to me because I'm like, wow, you guys weren't getting some of the, like, most important to us aspects of it, because we really put a lot of effort into those covers.
Well, you know, it was an interesting time in my life. Hey, tell us, Eric, please, where we can go to find out more about the Archie comic world.
You can go to archiecomics.com, and we are on pretty much every social media platform there is at Archie Comics. We also just recently launched a Discord for fans to chat about Archie. Again, you can access that at any of our social media at Archie Comics, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You will find us there.
Awesome. We've had a really wonderful time speaking with the senior editor of Archie Comics, Jamie Rotante. Jamie, thanks so much for being with us. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. This was a blast.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Pamela Leo. She'll be joining us from Portland, Maine to tell us all about her book fairy program. It's a really inspiring interview that you do not want to miss. Hey, if you're the author of a fantastic children's book, you may be frustrated at how difficult it is to let the world know all about it. After all, you haven't been around for decades like the Archie Comic Book series. You don't have a team working with you. You might just be working by yourself. You don't have to be working by yourself. We can help you celebrate your book. So many different ways we can help you let the world know all about it. You can be a guest here on the podcast. It's fun. It's easy. It doesn't cost a thing. You can also submit your book to our Certified Great Read panel. If they believe that your book is worthy of 4 or 5 out of 5 stars, it becomes a Certified Great Read. Or you can also take advantage of our monthly promotion program and celebrate your book through commercials here on the podcast with messages to our 90,000 plus social media followers, and also have your book displayed on our nationwide network of digital pedestrian billboards, and also take part in whatever live events we happen to be participating in a particular month. Learn about all these opportunities by going to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, clicking on the Authors Click Here button at the top of the page, and scrolling on down to the various services. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Jamie Rotante. Be sure to check out the Archie Comic Book series. I also want to thank our sponsors. Carry Me Home by Janet Fox, a great middle grade novel to remind us that homelessness is not helplessness. Also want to thank Room, Barry Carey, and the Super Boost by William Wilberforce III. I want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Nicole Belcastro, Ashley Contreras. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.